So we've been looking at the gradient panel and how we can do everything very numerically. And now let's take a look at the gradient tool. So all of our tools having to do with color are in this little section here. We have the gradient mesh, gradient tool, eyedropper, and the blend tool. So let's select our gradient tool and notice that it puts a gradient on here. Let's change our gradient to linear. Let's swap this and we'll make the stroke a solid color so that we can mainly focus. Let's pick a little bit lighter solid color so that we can focus on the gradient itself. And so here's our linear gradient inside of the triangle, and then here's our gradient tool sitting on top of it. So originally, and in other Adobe software, the way that you work with the gradient tool was if you had a linear gradient and you wanted to change how it looked, you would just click and drag, and you could drag it in the direction that you wanted the gradient to go. And if I switch it to radial, same thing, you can just click and drag wherever you want, and that shows how the gradient is going to go. But now the gradient tool, let's go back to linear here. Now the gradient tool is very, very smart. You might have noticed when I did the radial gradient, you saw a little circle around there. And that's a really powerful tool. And so often, I do use the gradient panel sometimes in combination with the tool, but many of the things that I want to do with my gradient are available right on the tool now. Notice when I put my cursor on top of the gradient tool on top of the shape, if I put my cursor there, I can see all of my color stops. And not only can I see them, I can work with them. So if I want to work with the color, I can simply double click and it brings up my color choices. Not only does it bring up my color choices, but I can also change the location and opacity. And I can choose between working with color sliders or working with my swatches panel. So I could change my color if I wanted to. I can also come out here and reposition color stops, reposition the mixers, and notice this one has an indicator that it has opacity. If I want to open that and turn it off, I can put the opacity back on 100%. So I can also type my locations if I want to put it back at 75. So it makes it really, really easy to work with your gradient from the document instead of having to go to the gradient panel. Now I can still click and drag to change the angle. I can rotate this by putting my cursor over this side with the square, and then the round side I can just pick it up and move it. So if I wanted this to be a tighter, smaller gradient, I can put it inside and then grab this other end and drag it in, and that makes my gradient really small and tight. I could also just do this, click and drag it, and put my gradient wherever I want. So the gradient tool is actually very, very powerful and a way of working with a gradient in a more artistic way than numerical. However, you can access all of your numerical options straight from the gradient panel. Okay, so next, let's change and look at the options that we have if we're doing a radial gradient. So I'm coming over to the gradient panel to switch to radial, and now I have the gradient tool here, and let's look at some of the options. So notice the color bar is still all the same. We have our color stops, and we can use that all in exactly the same way. But we have this new little circle that's going on around here, and this allows us to do some pretty cool things with the radial gradient. One thing you can do is you could grab this little circle here and you can use that to scale your gradient. Now, of course, you could also click and drag it the way you want. Where you start to click and drag from is going to put the center point, and then as you drag out, that says how spread out the gradient's going to be. So if I click and drag a long ways, I get a much softer gradient and the center point is over here. And if I click and drag a short way, then I have a smaller gradient going on inside. And I choose the angle by how straight I draw my line. So if I need it to be perfectly straight, I can do it that way, which may not seem so important on a radial gradient, but I'm going to show you some stuff that's really cool. So one of the things that you can do with a radial gradient, and it's pretty new for Illustrator, is you can change the ellipticalness of it. It doesn't have to be perfectly round. So watch, if I grab this dot and bring it down, I can create this to have much more of a cat's eye shape. And then if I want to, I can come over here and let me see if I can get the cursor looking round. See how it's in a round position right now? Once you get that little round shape, you can use that to rotate this. So notice I can rotate the cat's eye so that it has a different direction. And then if I want to reposition this so that the center point's in a different place, I'm going to grab this dot here. It allows me to pick it up and move it and put that center of the cat's eye in the center of the triangle if that's where I want it to be. So using the gradient tool is so much better now. It's so advanced. There's so many things that you can do. All you need to do is come out here and see what your different options are by putting your cursor on top, and it'll tell you what you can do. The cat eye option, the rotate option, the scale option, and then you also have your color bar that you can select and change your colors on. So that's a little bit about working with the gradient tool.